Earlier this month, Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States, announced he's running for president in 2024. This is historic news, as there's only been 4 other presidents in history who have chosen to run a third time after losing re-election following their first term in office. Out of this small group, only one prevailed, Grover Cleveland. He was the 22nd and 24th President of the United States, serving from 1885 to 1889 and then 1893 to 1897.
And had a very successful first term, but then lost to Benjamin Harrison because the economy had turned down. And he set that term through and then ran again in 1892 and ran that successfully and had a second term as president. That's the only time that's ever happened.
That's Ronald Gruner, an expert on presidential history and the author of We the Presidents: How American Presidents Shaped the Last Century. Gruner said that many historians note that Cleveland transformed into a different leader after winning his second term.
Many people felt that he had been, during his first term, he had been largely a hands-off president and really not particularly political at all. But in his second term, which was 8 years later, he was much more aggressive as a president, much more aggressive politically. And I think that affected his reputation a little bit as he ended that second presidency. He wasn't quite the same man and quite as beneficent as the first term.
Today, part of Cleveland's presidential history is that he's the only commander-in-chief to have 2 non-consecutive terms in office. There are 3 other presidents who ran again after losing re-election for their second term. These men are Martin Van Buren, Millard Fillmore, and Teddy Roosevelt. All had one thing in common.
They all ran as third-party tickets. They could not be nominated by their existing party, either Democrat or Republican, so they formed a third party or joined a small third party, and they were not successful in doing that.
Much of the reason why Cleveland was able to succeed and these other 3 former presidents did not was that he won the support of the Democratic Party. Gruner says that having this backing, whether it be Democratic or Republican, is crucial to the success of a campaign.
I think in general, parties feel, okay, if you've lost, you need to move on and we need to bring fresh blood in to run against a challenger on the other party. So that's very difficult to try to run with the existing party. I don't think parties like that.
With former President Donald Trump running again, many experts are wondering if the Republican Party will ultimately get behind his bid. If not, an independent run by Trump's campaign will likely mean much more of an uphill climb.
We've had third parties over the years that represented socialists, for example, represented climate change, represented the Green Party interests. We've had parties that represented minimizing immigration in the 19th century. So these parties pop up typically for 10 or 15 years, advocating a specific cause, and then they die out because they can't establish a large enough constituency or set of voters to win an election. And they typically steal votes from existing parties, and so they oftentimes act as spoilers.
One example of this is Teddy Roosevelt's run for presidency in 1912. Roosevelt served as the 26th president from 1901 to 1909. In the early 20th century, there was no law stopping a president from serving more than 2 terms in office. However, it was tradition to step down after 8 years to make way for a new leader. Roosevelt honored this in 1909, but by 1912, decided to put his hat back in the race. But this time, he failed to get the nomination of the Republican Party.
So he started the Bull Moose Party, which was a party focused around progressive values that were somewhat at odds with the Republican Party. Although he got 27% of the vote, that's Teddy Roosevelt, the largest ever accomplished by a third party. He still lost to Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat.
So, apart from having your party's backing, what does it take to become the commander-in-chief in today's crowded political landscape? Gruner argues that there are several different dynamics at play, but a candidate's ability to communicate effectively and create a positive public image is key.
Communication in the 19th century, for example, when Grover Cleveland ran, when he ran the first time, he only gave 2 campaign speeches. Just think about that, 2 campaign speeches. He said, let the record speak for me and others speak for him. But nowadays, to run for a political office, in many cases, you have to be very, very good with the media, be able to communicate well, charm the constituency, And communications and how you present yourself is extremely important. So people look at, was that a good speech or a bad speech? May not look quite so much as the ideas in the speech, but the speech itself. So that's one of the largest factors, I think, that affects how we have elections today versus how we had elections during Grover Cleveland's time.
Today, the advent of social media, TV debates, and countless campaign stops across the country have made presidential campaigns a much different affair than 100 years back.
Campaigning has always been trying to win the hearts, if not the minds, of the populace. And I think in the past, we may have voted more logically based on results and policies because we didn't know people face to face. And we didn't have that kind of media. And even with radio, it wasn't quite the same. But now we know people so well. We see their facial expressions when they give a speech. That has become so important. And so often what you hear, even in the last few months, about President Biden and former President Trump is comments about how they speak or mistakes they make and things of that nature. So that's really paramount.
With 2023 just around the corner, election season will be here before we know it. Ultimately, the decision comes down to the American people, and that's why it's so important to cast your vote. To find out more about this topic and our guest, Ronald Gruner, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also find Gruner's book, We the Presidents, in select bookstores and online at Amazon.com. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
Amazon seems totally invincible. I think, last year Facebook seemed totally invincible, and then it went all meta on us and seems highly invincible at this point.
Exploring the decline of another seemingly invincible company, General Electric. Then,
the waitress will bring this big slab of cream pie to the table, and just like you look to the table next to you and you look over and say, I want a piece of that.
You're gonna need to grab a piece of pie after this story. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.